October 15th, 1942. The marble halls of the Palazzo Braschi in Rome echoed with the sound of polished boots as Italy's highest-ranking military commanders filed into the ornate conference room. The massive table, carved from Carrara marble and bearing the fascist symbol of Mussolini's regime, was surrounded by men whose uniforms displayed the ribbons and medals of a generation of Italian military leadership. At the head of the table sat Marshal Pietro Badoglio, Chief of the General Staff, his weathered face bearing the weight of knowledge that would soon destroy careers and shatter illusions. For 2 hours, these generals had been reviewing reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture. The numbers were undeniable, the conclusions inescapable, and the implications catastrophic for fascist Italy's war effort. What they were about to discuss would be considered treason by Mussolini's standards, but professional duty demanded they confront the mathematical reality of Italy's strategic position. The war that had begun with dreams of Mediterranean dominance and renewed Roman glory had devolved into a nightmare of logistical impossibility and military humiliation. Marshal Badoglio cleared his throat and began with words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Gentlemen, we must face what our pride refuses to acknowledge. Italy cannot win this war." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of Rome's traffic filtering through the heavy curtains. Every officer present understood the gravity of this statement, but more importantly, they understood it was true. To comprehend how Italy's military leadership reached this devastating conclusion, we must examine the cascade of failures that had brought them to this moment. When Mussolini declared war on Britain and France in June 1940, Italy's generals had expressed private concerns that were dismissed as defeatist pessimism. The Deuce believed that Germany's rapid victories would create opportunities for Italy to seize territories and restore Italian greatness in the Mediterranean. He had calculated on a short war, quick gains, and minimal cost. He was catastrophically wrong on every count. General Mario Roatta, Chief of Army Staff, presented the first devastating analysis. Italy's military production capacity was revealing itself as fundamentally inadequate for sustained modern warfare. Italian factories were producing approximately 1,200 aircraft annually, while Britain alone was manufacturing over 20,000. The numbers for tanks were even more humiliating. Italy's Fiat works could produce perhaps 200 medium tanks per year, while the Soviet Union was turning out thousands monthly despite being partially occupied. But raw production numbers told only part of the story. Italian equipment was proving inferior in every category that mattered. The M13 tank, Italy's primary armoured vehicle, was outmatched by virtually every Allied tank it encountered. Its 47mm gun couldn't penetrate British armour at combat ranges, while British guns could destroy Italian tanks from distances that made return fire impossible. Italian aircraft suffered similar disadvantages. The Macchi 200 fighter, while manoeuvrable, lacked the speed and firepower to compete with Spitfires, Hurricanes, or American fighters entering service. Admiral Arturo Riccardi delivered the naval assessment that crushed any remaining optimism. The Italian Navy had begun the war as a formidable force, but 18 months of combat had revealed fatal strategic vulnerabilities. Italy's lack of aircraft carriers meant that naval operations beyond the range of land-based aircraft were essentially impossible. British carrier-based planes had demonstrated this limitation catastrophically at Taranto in November 1940, when a single night attack had crippled half of Italy's battleship fleet. The submarine warfare statistics were equally grim. Italian submarines had achieved minimal success despite sophisticated designs and brave crews. The Mediterranean's clear waters and Britain's advanced sonar technology had turned submarine operations into suicide missions. Italy was losing submarines faster than they could be replaced, while achieving negligible impact on Allied shipping. Meanwhile, British submarines operating from Malta and Gibraltar were strangling Italian supply lines to North Africa. General Vittorio Ambrosio presented the most damning evidence of all, the casualty figures from Italy's multiple fronts. In North Africa, Italian forces under German command were suffering appalling losses for minimal territorial gains. The campaign that was supposed to deliver Egypt and the Suez Canal had instead become a grinding war of attrition that Italy couldn't sustain. Desert warfare demanded specialized equipment, extensive logistics, and constant resupply of water, fuel, and ammunition across vast distances. Italy's industrial base simply couldn't support these requirements. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Artillery shells were rationed because factories couldn't produce sufficient quantities. Medical supplies were so scarce that field hospitals were operating with equipment that belonged in museums rather than modern medical facilities. Soldiers were dying not just from enemy action, but from preventable diseases and inadequate medical care. The Greek campaign had proven even more catastrophic for Italian military prestige. What Mussolini had envisioned as a quick conquest to match German victories in Western Europe had devolved into a humiliating stalemate that required German intervention to prevent complete Italian collapse. Italian forces had been pushed back into Albania by Greek defenders, who were supposedly inferior in every military category. The mountain warfare in Greece during winter had exposed every weakness in Italian military doctrine, equipment, and logistics. Italian soldiers were fighting in uniforms designed for Mediterranean climates while enduring alpine conditions. Their boots fell apart in mountain terrain. Their weapons froze in sub-zero temperatures. Supply lines through Albanian mountains became impassable during winter storms, leaving entire divisions without food, ammunition, or medical supplies for weeks at a time. The casualty rates from frostbite and disease exceeded those from combat operations. Marshal Badoglio pulled out another document that made the strategic situation even bleaker. Intelligence reports indicated that the United States was just beginning to mobilize its industrial capacity for war production. American factories were converting from civilian to military production on a scale that dwarfed anything Europe had seen. The projections suggested that by 1943, American war production would exceed the combined output of Germany and Italy by factors that made resistance mathematically futile. But perhaps most devastating was the fuel situation. Italy's entire war effort depended on oil imports that were increasingly impossible to obtain. Romania provided some petroleum, but transportation through the Balkans was vulnerable to Allied bombing and partisan attacks. Synthetic fuel production in Italy was negligible compared to German efforts. Italian ships, aircraft, and vehicles were operating with fuel reserves measured in weeks rather than months. The generals reviewed intelligence estimates of Allied strength that revealed the true scope of Italy's strategic predicament. British Empire forces were recovering from early defeats and receiving American equipment in massive quantities. Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front was tying down German forces that might otherwise support Italian operations. The entry of the United States meant that Allied production capacity would soon overwhelm Axis resources through sheer industrial mathematics. General Roata presented fuel consumption calculations that demolished any hope of prolonged resistance. Italy's military consumed approximately 200,000 tons of fuel monthly during active operations. Available supplies, including optimistic projections of future deliveries, could sustain current operations for perhaps 6 months. After that, Italian forces would be effectively immobilized regardless of their fighting spirit or tactical competence. The meeting examined alternatives that might salvage something from the strategic disaster. Perhaps Italy could negotiate a separate peace with Britain, similar to what Finland would eventually achieve with the Soviet Union. Intelligence assessments suggested this was highly unlikely. The British government under Churchill had committed to unconditional surrender for all Axis powers. Italy's attacks on British positions in Africa and the Mediterranean had created animosity that precluded negotiated settlements. Another possibility involved withdrawing Italian forces to defensive positions within Italy itself, forcing the Allies to conduct costly amphibious assaults against prepared positions. But this strategy required resources Italy didn't possess. Coastal fortifications needed massive amounts of concrete, steel, and artillery that Italian industry couldn't provide. Moreover, defending the entire Italian peninsula would require troop concentrations that existing logistics couldn't supply. The admirals and generals reached their conclusion through cold mathematical analysis rather than emotional assessment. Every calculation pointed to the same result. Italy lacked the industrial capacity, natural resources, and strategic position necessary for victory in a prolonged modern war. The most chilling analysis came from Colonel Giuseppe Cordero Lanza di Montezemolo, head of military intelligence, who had spent months compiling data that no one wanted to hear. His reports detailed the systematic collapse of Italian morale across every theatre of operations. Desertion rates were climbing exponentially. Entire units were surrendering without resistance when faced with Allied attacks. Officers were reporting that their men openly questioned the purpose of continued fighting, but the morale crisis extended beyond the rank and file. Italian commanders in the field were sending increasingly desperate requests for equipment, reinforcements, and supplies that simply didn't exist. General Italo Garibaldi, commanding Italian forces in North Africa, had submitted requisitions for 50,000 replacement troops, 200 tanks, and 500 trucks. The response from Rome had been silence because there were no replacements to send. Italy's manpower reserves were exhausted. Her factories were operating at maximum capacity while producing inadequate quantities, and her transportation network was crumbling under Allied bombing. The intelligence reports revealed another devastating reality that struck at the heart of fascist ideology. Italian civilians were losing faith in the regime's promises of victory and glory. Food rationing had reduced most Italians to subsistence-level nutrition. Consumer goods had virtually disappeared from shops. Factory workers were laboring 12-hour shifts 7 days a week, while their sons died in foreign deserts for causes that seemed increasingly meaningless. Underground resistance movements were emerging in northern Italy, supported by communist organizers and liberal opponents of fascism. These groups were conducting sabotage operations against military installations and transportation infrastructure. More importantly, they were demonstrating that significant portions of the Italian population no longer supported the war effort. Fighting external enemies while facing internal rebellion was a strategic impossibility for any nation, much less one with Italy's limited resources. Marshal Badoglio presented the most sensitive intelligence of all, reports from German officers serving alongside Italian forces. These documents, obtained through carefully cultivated sources, revealed German contempt for Italian military capabilities. German commanders considered Italian troops unreliable, Italian equipment inferior, and Italian logistics hopelessly inadequate. The alliance that was supposed to guarantee Italian security had become a relationship of barely concealed German domination and Italian dependence. Worse still, intelligence suggested that Germany was making contingency plans for defending Europe without significant Italian participation. German forces were being positioned to control Alpine passes that could prevent Allied advances through Italy into German territory. This meant that Germany viewed Italy not as a valuable ally, but as a potential liability that might need to be abandoned when strategic circumstances demanded. The economic analysis presented by Colonel Emilio de Bono painted the bleakest picture yet. Italy's national debt had tripled since entering the war. Government revenues were collapsing as economic activity declined and tax collection became impossible in combat zones. The lira was losing value so rapidly that international trade was becoming impossible except through barter arrangements that favored Italy's trading partners. Industrial production was declining despite maximum effort, because raw materials were unavailable and transportation systems were breaking down. Steel production had dropped 40% from pre-war levels. Aluminum, essential for aircraft manufacturing, was so scarce that existing aircraft were being cannibalized for parts to keep others flying copper wire was being removed from civilian electrical systems to meet military requirements. The agricultural situation was equally catastrophic. Italy had always imported significant quantities of food, but wartime shipping losses and foreign exchange shortages had reduced food imports to minimal levels. Domestic agricultural production was declining because fertilizers were unavailable, and farm workers had been conscripted for military service. Malnutrition was becoming widespread in urban areas, while rural regions hoarded food rather than shipping it to cities. General Ambrosio raised the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. How long could Italy continue fighting before complete social and economic collapse made organized resistance impossible? His calculations suggested that Italy had perhaps 12 months before civilian infrastructure failed completely. After that point, maintaining military forces in the field would become impossible, regardless of political will or ideological commitment. The discussion turned to the immediate tactical situation that made strategic planning even more difficult. Italian forces were engaged on multiple fronts simultaneously, each requiring resources that didn't exist. The Eastern Front consumed Italian troops who were poorly equipped for Russian winters and received minimal German support. The Balkans required occupation forces to suppress partisan movements, while protecting supply lines to German forces. Further east, North Africa demanded constant reinforcement to prevent complete collapse of Axis positions. Every front was a drain on resources, without offering realistic prospects for decisive victory. Italian commanders were being forced to choose between impossible alternatives. Reinforcing one theatre meant weakening others. Concentrating forces for offensive operations left defensive positions vulnerable to Allied counterattacks. The strategic initiative had passed completely to the Allies, who could choose when and where to attack. While Italy could only react to threats, Admiral Riccardi detailed the naval situation that had become utterly hopeless. Italian surface vessels were essentially trapped in port by Allied air superiority and submarine activities. Fuel shortages prevented major naval operations even when tactical opportunities arose. The few remaining operational submarines were achieving minimal results while suffering prohibitive losses. Italian naval aviation had been reduced to a handful of obsolete aircraft, operating from bases that were bombed regularly. The Mediterranean Sea, which Mussolini had proclaimed would become an Italian lake, was now completely dominated by Allied naval forces operating from Gibraltar, Malta, and increasingly from North African ports, captured from Italian defenders. Italian merchant shipping had been reduced to coastal trade, conducted at night to avoid Allied air attacks. The supply lines to North Africa that were essential for continued resistance had become so tenuous that German commanders were planning withdrawals regardless of Italian preferences. Colonel Montezemolo presented the final piece of intelligence that eliminated any remaining hope for Italian recovery. Allied production schedules indicated that American war material would begin arriving in massive quantities by early 1943. Liberty ships were being produced at rates that would soon overwhelm Axis submarine capabilities. American aircraft were entering service with performance characteristics that made existing Italian fighters obsolete. Most critically, American ground forces were training for operations that intelligence suggested would target Italian territory directly. The implications were inescapable. Italy faced invasion by enemies whose industrial capacity exceeded Italian production by orders of magnitude. Italian forces would be defending territory with equipment that was already obsolete against opponents who would possess overwhelming advantages in every category of military technology. The mathematical certainty of defeat was absolute. Marshal Badoglio looked around the table at faces that reflected his own grim understanding. These were professional military officers who had dedicated their lives to serving Italy. Their duty required honest assessment of strategic realities regardless of political consequences. The conclusion was unavoidable. Though voicing it constituted treason under fascist law, Italy had lost the war. The only remaining questions were how many more Italians would die before this reality was acknowledged, and whether anything could be salvaged from the approaching catastrophe. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes. Each general understood that what had been spoken could never be taken back. They had crossed a line that separated professional military assessment from political reality. In Mussolini's Italy, acknowledging defeat was tantamount to betrayal of the fascist revolution itself. General Ambrosio finally broke the oppressive quiet with a question that would haunt them all. What do we tell the Duce? The room stirred uncomfortably. Everyone knew that Mussolini refused to hear assessments that contradicted his vision of inevitable Italian triumph. He had dismissed previous warnings as defeatist propaganda. He had replaced commanders who suggested strategic caution. He had created an atmosphere where truth-telling was career suicide. Marshal Badoglio had witnessed this pattern repeatedly. Officers who presented realistic assessments found themselves transferred to meaningless positions or forced into early retirement. Those who echoed Mussolini's optimistic pronouncements received promotions and decorations. The entire command structure had been corrupted by the need to tell the Duce what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The problem went beyond individual career preservation. Italy's military planning had become divorced from strategic reality because accurate information was systematically suppressed. Operations were planned based on wishful thinking rather than honest capability assessments. Resources were allocated according to political priorities rather than military necessities. The disconnect between leadership expectations and battlefield realities was growing wider with each passing month. Colonel Montezemolo raised another uncomfortable truth. Even if they could convince Mussolini to accept their assessment, what alternatives existed? Italy was locked into the German alliance by treaties, economic dependence, and political ideology. Breaking with Germany would invite immediate occupation by Wehrmacht forces already positioned throughout northern Italy. Continuing the alliance meant accepting subordination to German strategic priorities that treated Italian interests as expendable. The intelligence reports detailed German contingency plans that revealed Berlin's true attitude toward its Italian ally. Wehrmacht planners were already identifying defensive lines that ran through Italian territory without regard for Italian sovereignty. German forces would retreat through Italy while destroying infrastructure to slow Allied advances. Italian cities would become battlefields in a war between Germany and the Anglo-American coalition. Admiral Riccardi presented naval intelligence that made the situation even more desperate. British codebreakers were reading Italian naval communications with disturbing accuracy. Nearly every Italian naval operation was known to the enemy before execution ships sailed into ambushes because their movements had been compromised. Submarine patrols encountered Allied forces that seemed to know exactly where Italian vessels would appear. This intelligence compromise extended beyond naval operations. German security services had identified multiple breaches in Italian communications security. Allied intelligence was penetrating Italian military planning at levels that made successful operations nearly impossible. Every strategic initiative was compromised before implementation. Italy was fighting with its cards face up while the enemy held their hands hidden. October 15th, 1942, was the day Italy's generals faced the mathematical certainty of defeat. In that marble conference room, professional military duty collided with political loyalty, and truth emerged victorious over comfortable delusion. Marshal Badoglio and his commanders had done what Mussolini's regime forbade them to do. They had calculated honestly, assessed realistically, and reached conclusions that shattered every fascist fantasy about Mediterranean dominance and renewed Roman glory. 9 months later, Italy would surrender unconditionally, proving that these generals had been devastatingly correct in their analysis. Sometimes the most patriotic act is acknowledging when your nation cannot win, even when that truth is too dangerous to speak aloud.